Wouldn't you think that a person becoming a Christian would be the end of the whole diabolical project to getting someone to choose hell? Apparently not. They can still use the patient's impressions of the church and the other Christians who go there, and they can use the inevitable disappointment that follows the initial euphoria of conversion, and they can use the actual bad attitudes and behaviors that Christians actually display to pull us back out of the faith. Here's how the second letter of the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis begins.
My dear Wormwood, I note with grave displeasure that your patient has become a Christian.
You'd think that this would be a very serious setback for the demonic forces. And it is. But Screwtape explains that it's not as serious as one might think.
There is no need to despair. Hundreds of these adult converts have been reclaimed after a brief sojourn in the enemy's camp, and are now with us. All the habits of the patient, both mental and bodily, are still in our favor.
Screwtape explains that even though the patient has turned toward God, all his habits are still aiming in the other direction. Habits are powerful, so powerful that they shape who we are. They shape our identity. They can shape us into being a citizen of the kingdom, or they can shape us into something entirely different. The devils know how vulnerable a new convert is, and they exploit that vulnerability. Screwtape continues.
One of our greatest allies at present is the church itself. Do not misunderstand me. I do not mean the church as we see her, spread throughout all time and space and rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with banners. That, I confess, is a spectacle which makes our boldest tempters uneasy.
So there's the church. And there's the church. The angels and demons see the church, capital C, that's rooted in eternity. But we humans don't see that one. We see the one that's made of brick and mortar. The one that contains a bunch of people that, if we encountered them anywhere else, we would probably avoid them. The patient has probably heard phrases like, the community of saints, and the family of God. But these are not yet real to him. Screwtape explains that what Wormwood needs to do is
make his mind flit to and fro between an expression like the body of Christ and the actual faces in the next pew. It matters very little, of course, what kind of people that next pew really contains. You may know one of them to be a great warrior on the enemy's side. No matter. Your patient, thanks to our Father below, is a fool, provided that any of those neighbors sing out of tune, or have boots that squeak, or double chins, or odd clothes. The patient will quite easily believe that their religion must therefore be somehow ridiculous.
I've seen this happen firsthand. I went to church with someone dear to me, but they weren't really all that keen to be there. They were there out of kindness to me. After the service, he commented disparagingly on the ridiculousness of the middle-aged woman that sat in front of us. She was dressed kind of fancy, and when she raised her hands for the singing, both were laden with pretentious-looking jewelry. This woman may have been a great prayer warrior, but my guest only saw an ostentatious old lady. I must admit that in my early years I did this sort of thing a lot. But now I realize that I wasn't nearly as clever as I thought I was. In those judgy moments, I was under the influence of a tempter. New Christians are very vulnerable in the first weeks and months, because the initial enthusiasm will diminish, and there will be disappointment and anticlimax. Screwtape explains that
the enemy allows this disappointment to occur at the threshold of every human endeavor.
This is a thing, isn't it? First being enchanted by the adventures of the Odyssey, but later having to learn Greek. Falling in love, yay, but then having to work really hard to build a life together. But I know that you can add all kinds of examples of your own. Here's one of mine. I remember when I was 11, I got my first trombone. I wasn't allowed to take it out of the case until I knew how to put it together and treat it properly. So I would just gaze at it shining in that plush case. I couldn't wait to learn how to play it. 6 months later, I was howling and having to go upstairs and practice my scales. This sort of thing happens when you become a Christian as well. There's the initial high right after conversion, and not too long after that comes the real work of being a Christian. Why does God allow this disappointment or anticlimax? Screwtape knows exactly why. He explains it to Wormwood.
The enemy takes this risk because he has a curious fantasy of making these disgusting little vermin into what he calls his free lovers and servants. Sons is the word he uses. With his inveterate love of degrading the whole spiritual world by unnatural liaisons with the two-legged animals. Desiring their freedom, he therefore refuses to carry them by their mere affections and habits to any of the goals which he sets before them. He leaves them to do it on their own.
If we became a Christian and then immediately everything was sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows, well, we wouldn't be free in our coming to and remaining with him. We would be compelled to be Christians by all the sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows. And another thing, Look at the mess that is produced by helicopter or lawnmower or bulldozer parents. They work so hard to protect their children from the trials and tribulations of life and from the consequences of their own decisions. God isn't a helicopter parent. He takes the risk with us. But Screwtape says God's approach is also trouble for the tempters.
He leaves them to do it on their own. And there lies our opportunity. But also remember, there lies our danger. If once they get through this initial dryness successfully, they become much less dependent on emotion and therefore much harder to tempt.
So do you wonder why it's so hard sometimes? And why God seems to have withdrawn his hand from your life? Well, now you know. So far, Screwtape has been explaining how to exploit irrational grounds to amplify the natural disappointment that the patient will experience as he observes the people in the next pew. It is so much easier when there are rational grounds for this disappointment. Like you know that guy is parsimonious, or she has a temper, or that one spends 8 hours a day gaming. All Wormwood needs to do then is to keep one thought out of the patient's mind. Here's that thought.
If I, being what I am, can consider that I am in some sense a Christian, why should the different vices of those people in the next pew prove that their religion is mere hypocrisy and convention?
Screwtape anticipates Wormwood's incredulity on this point. Is it possible that you can keep such a simple and rational thought out of the patient's mind? It is possible. It's because immature Christians are not yet humble enough. They can list a bunch of things that God has done for them, but deep down they have a few items on the list that they have done for God. One of which is that they allowed themselves to be converted. But there's more. It's good practice for each of us now and then to pull up our spiritual ledger book and to erase all those items that we've snuck onto the credit side of the balance sheet. Look for things like faithful church attendance, daily prayer and Bible reading, tossing an extra 100 into the offering, and continue to not drink to excess or smoke or chew or swear, or not to have sex outside of marriage, or not have a tattoo that isn't a cross. The closer we get to true humility, the closer we get to being able to look at that fellow sinner in the next pew and love our neighbor as ourself. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.